University of Ottawa, close to Aisha in Toronto. Close to Montreal, actually. So I can drive.
Nice try.
So,
closer to Montreal than Toronto is.
yes, close to Montreal. So, this session is about analytics around the world, the future of analytics. So we have a couple of presentations there that are we've adapted, let's say, as we've gone through towards the end of the session. So David will start with some work he's doing on risk assessment, and then Richard will talk to you a little bit about application analytics and some work he's doing there. And I'll have a chat with you about this notion of the future of analytics. More to the point of, we can research how to do point analytics. We sort of know how to do most of these things. The question is, how do you institutionalize that within organizations so that it becomes part of how they do business on a daily basis? So that's sort of the research that I'm doing at this point. So we'll go through that. And we're a small enough group that we can find out who everybody is. I know these folks are in front, so.
Hi, I'm Joanna Irigoyen. I'm coming from Atlanta, Georgia, and I work for Cox Automotive.
Ah, okay.
So I'm from business side.
You're from industry, yeah,
Yes.
great, that's super, yeah.
I'm Alex Fairwarn from Ryerson University, going to get that quite a lot.
Oh, yeah, okay. Ryerson as well?
I'm on from the computer science.
Yeah, computer science, yeah.
I am Amy Casey, and I'm not in the computer science side. I'm from the provost office at Ryerson University.
Oh, so you're keeping an eye on Asia, okay, got it.
Yeah, exactly. You know, someone has to.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I'm Peggy Steele, and I'm also from Ryerson.
Ryerson, okay, great. Hi.
I'm Gregory from Hydro-Quebec and Power Production Plant.
Hydro-Quebec, bonjour, enchanté, I'm Gregory as well, so thanks for coming. Yeah.
I'm Mike Rogan from St. Leo University. I'm a faculty in the business school.
Yeah.
Tampa, Florida.
In the business school, great, I'm in the business school too, I like that.
I'm Sylvie Martel from NATO.
From NATO?
A different group.
Oh, welcome. So what kind of work do you do in NATO?
I'm the chief for the operational analysis group within the NATO Communications and Information Regions.
Ah, okay. So you're watching lots of data go by. So those of you who just came in, what I said is we actually have 3 presentations to go through. David will talk to you about quantitative risk. Richard will talk to you about location analytics, and then I'll talk with you about this notion of how to integrate analytics within organizations. It's an issue that I know a lot of organizations are looking at. So, and we'll have a conversation as we go through. If you have questions or comments, go ahead and interrupt him. Otherwise, he won't stop talking. So I'll try to keep everything on time as we move forward. Okay.
So yeah, this is my first, is this an academic conference?
It's a mix, obviously. We have a nice mix here, so this is kind of cool.
So I'm not an operations research person. I'm not really in academia, although I'm currently at University of Ottawa for a couple of years. I'm with the federal government in Canada, and I'm an internal auditor, but not a tax auditor, so don't worry. So this should be, hopefully this will be interesting. What I want to look at is risk, and I want to look at it from a couple of points of view. One is, to me as an auditor, risk is always to the achievement of your strategic objectives. So I want to look at the development of the corporate risk profile and how poorly done that is normally. And I also want to look at risk within activities or projects and how you can use quantitative indicators to try to improve your measurement of risk and allow you to drill down and do other things with it. And the last piece, I'm just going to introduce the notion of integrating KRIs, risk indicators, with KPIs, performance measures. And I'll be talking about some examples from Australia, from the private sector, from the federal government, and one other place that I can't remember right now, so hopefully it's in here. So what's the problem typically with risk assessments? For the most part, they're very qualitative. Management sort of sits around and talks about, you know, what's keeping you awake at night, things like that. They tend to be done once a year, and then kind of put on the shelf. They might be used a little bit as part of their initial strategic planning process, but then they're forgotten. They tend to be top down, or bottom up, but you can't really go both ways with either of them. You can only go one way if you're lucky. So for example, let's suppose that you decided that one of your risks is the information system isn't providing reliable information for management decision making. Is that because of the information system? Is it because of the HR aspects of it? Is it because of the data aspects of it? You know, what are kicking in and causing that to be a risk? They don't tend to break that down. Basically, put it another way, you don't really know what you need to mitigate and how to mitigate it or where to mitigate it. So I want to look at that. There was a COSO report called Developing Key Risk Indicators to Strengthen Enterprise Risk Management. And they say that the use of KRIs, key risk indicators, to anticipate emerging shifts in risk over time can reduce losses and identify opportunities for strategic advantages. And yet, we're still not doing that because it's qualitative. So this is an example I've been working on with Australian government. And they are, what they're trying to do is quantify risks so that they can drill down into the organization and profile where the risks are occurring. They also want to be able to monitor control effectiveness in areas of higher risk and provide an ongoing basis for improving the business operations. Again, the achievement of strategic objectives. So what do? Well, first of all, they identify the key control areas. They identify the data that supports the business process. So what data is being generated by the business process and how is it being used. And then they measure the effectiveness of the controls to mitigate those risks. And depending on, like in this case, they're saying that it's satisfactory. Depending on how that rating is, it'll determine what they're going to do next. Some of the responses are they would do periodic monitoring in areas where the risk is deemed to be fairly low. They want to test the controls to ensure that they continue to be effective. And continuous review in the areas of higher risk. Flipping to another use. This is COSO. They recently introduced, 2013, they introduced principle number 8, which is that organizations should assess fraud risk. So I'm working with COSO to develop guidance to update a document they have right now, which is managing the business risk of fraud. The guidance that we're developing suggests that we should be using data analytics in fraud risk assessment, as well as fraud prevention, fraud detection, fraud investigation, and the ongoing monitoring of the mitigation of those fraud risks. The American Certified Fraud Examiners, they do a study every 2 years on fraud. So the 2014 study says that proactive data monitoring and analysis results in frauds being 60% less costly and 50% shorter in duration. So it's an area where we can have a major impact on, I don't know how many $1 trillion it is worldwide, fraud. I think it's somewhere between $3 and $5 trillion a year. The guidance is going to illustrate some of the uses of data analytics to detect fraud by testing key controls. So we're looking at this one here, where you look at what are the data fields that support the business process, who could manipulate them, how could they manipulate them, and then look at what controls are in place. And if the controls aren't working, what it will look like in the data. And we encourage people to go the other way. You start with the controls and move across to the data, and then how it could be possibly manipulated and affected. And then to identify those symptoms of the fraud in the data. We're also going to be suggesting things like sentiment analysis, so there's a couple of groups downstairs that we're talking about that. Performing keyword searches, establishing relationships and link analysis, as well as patterns over time. For some of you, you may be going, yeah, but for the auditors, I mean, this is pretty new and pretty fresh and pretty difficult in some ways for them, so we have to.
I imagine the Canadian Senate would have enjoyed hearing about control weaknesses.
Coincidentally, I actually developed after the fact about 30 tests of controls. I wasn't allowed to see the results of the data, but I had to turn my back, and they were going, oh my God, there's more, it's worse than we thought. So, yeah, no kidding. On the private sector side, I was talking with some folks from Deloitte, and they're using analytics to assess system development projects, to assist organizations in developing proper structures to help to ensure the success of system development projects. I think system development projects have about a 30% total failure rate.
Yep, 30% success and 40% challenged.
Yeah, so in the federal government in Canada, they were saying that 50% never deliver anything. Of the 50% that deliver, 50% of those don't deliver the full functionality and it's late and costly. Of the other 25%, I find it hard to believe they actually delivered on time and the full capability, but some combination of on time or capability. So they look at the risk of failure is tied very specifically to project complexity. I said 30 to 40 there. I think they have 70 indicators of project complexity. And what they will do is map your project against other projects in their database, in particular against successful projects, and then talk to you about what sort of structures and processes and governance and everything else you should have in place to increase the likelihood of your project being a success.
Which consultancy was that, David?
Deloitte.
Lloyd.
Used to be Deloitte Touche Ross.
Yeah.
In the Canadian government, we're using analytics to support the analysis of risk in 3 major areas. One is, as an auditor, we have to produce a risk-based audit plan every year. Where are we going to go? What are we going to look at? And when we go there, what specifically are we concerned about? What are the risks? From a central agency point of view, the Treasury Board Secretariat looks at all the major projects of the government, and they're trying to decide after the CF-35 fiasco and other fiascos, what they should be looking at, which projects are risky and deserves their attention as opposed to other projects that can be sort of just shuffled along, so to speak. And then the third area, it's tied to, what's it called? MAF. Management Accountability Framework, where we're looking at the financial performance of individual departments. And typically what we're finding is that departments self-assess, again, qualitative and no challenge, they're self-assessing and they get a really good math score, and then the next week they're in the newspaper for something terrible that they've done related to financial performance or contracting or something else. And it's, at a minimum, a little embarrassing. So in each of the examples, there's really a need to supplement that qualitative nature of the risk assessment that's going on by some quantitative indicators. And when I'm giving this to the federal government folks, I talk about the fact that it really needs to be a byproduct of a system, of an operational system. I think you were mentioning that earlier, that it has to be the byproduct so that they can't, well, they can't bias it in any way, so they're not self-reporting, they're not manipulating things to report in a certain way. It's also not a big burden on them. It's just, it's coming out of their financial system, it's coming out of their HR system, it's coming out of their operational system. It's certainly better react to levels of risk. As they change, they better show a reaction to it. And it should be transaction-based so that we can actually drill down from a high level and drill down to the basics to find out what's going on and roll up as well. So typically risk is probability and impact. And I'm saying that if we want to move from subjective or qualitative assessment to data-driven, then we can really think of risk as a function of variability or change or uncertainty and complexity and volume. So probability is affected when you have more uncertainty, more change, more variability. It's also affected when you have more complexity in the management frameworks and in the environment in which the controls are trying to operate. And impact is simply affected by the materiality, volume, and size. This becomes a lot easier to measure from a data perspective than probability and impact. Although I have seen formulas that talk about probability and impact, but I find this a little bit easier to do. So for example, if I'm on the HR side and looking at HR risk, it's a little bit, there's a difference between if I'm managing a bunch of full-time employees at a single location versus I have seasonal workers, part-time workers, multiple locations, different unions to deal with, job classifications to deal with. It becomes a much more complex HR environment. So what we do is we can measure the corporate risks. So we can actually look at it, developing indicators for each of the corporate risks, and determine where each of the activities, whether it be plants, whether it be regions, whatever, however you break down your entities, how they are contributing to each of the corporate risks. So if I am auditing corporate risk 5, I may know that where I really need to go is entity number 11 and entity number 16. Conversely, from an audit perspective, where we tend to audit activities, if I'm auditing activity 2, then perhaps I'm going to be going to see, I want to pay attention to how it's contributing to the corporate risk, different corporate risks. Does that make sense? Yeah.
You're translating those numbers into a rank?
Yes. So it's a relative ranking.
Okay. So it's an additive process, or where they are in the range of risk factors?
Where they are in the range of risk factors. So we'll see that in a second. So it's not a cutoff. It's not like you have to hit this level. It's, the lowest risk gets a score of 1 or 0. I think it's 1. 0. 0. So then I want to look at it from another perspective, because typically I find the corporate risks, I don't know what the right word is, they suck. They're so high level and such a pain, and from an audit perspective, we just can't deal with it. It's impossible to deal with, although this is helping us. Because now we can say, you know what, that is a concern, but here's where it's a concern, so we're going to audit this area. But we looked at other things as well, so risk categories. And we've come up with 9 different risk categories. IBM did the CFO study, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. Might have been more than that. Noted that businesses need to develop a more holistic view of risk. They were too focused on financial risk, and to the exclusion of other areas. And that organizations face a wide variety of risks, and they need to focus on those that are going to have the greatest impact. A couple of years ago, one of the consulting firms did a study of Fortune 500 companies that lost 50% more or more of their market share. And they said in almost every case it was not financial risk that caused that. It was a combination of other risks. So you really need to be considering these. And the IBM study said you should be looking at strategic, regulatory, HR, and operational in addition to. So how do you do this? I'm going to use HR and finance because they tend to be a little more common across industries. Basically, you start with your HR risks and you break it down into different risk categories and subcategories. So from an HR perspective, there is a risk that we're going to fail to attract the right people. That's a standard HR risk. If I look at that and say, what's that going to result in? It's going to result in a lack of resources. We won't have the right people in the right places. And if I look at the indicators for that, I'm going to have things like percentage of vacancies, percentage of acting appointments, training dollars, all things that I can measure very, very easily from our HR system. Failure to retain employees. Well, this could be measured by indicators such as turnover, number of grievances, number of sick days, amount of overtime, average age, eligibility for retirement in the next 2 years. And some of them are measures that are sort of current, and some of them are a little bit of a leading indicator that down the road we're going to be running into problems. So it highlights emerging risks. Once you've taken your risk and your risk subcategories and come up with your indicators, you break them up into, are they related to volume, are they related to variability or change, or are they related to complexity? So, as I said, we're going to have a more complex environment if we have a number of different classifications, types of employees, number of unions, standard and non-standard working hours. We're going to have more variability and change. We look at the average age of senior managers who can retire, the experience in the department and the position in the organization, et cetera, et cetera. From a financial perspective, it's the same idea. We look at the risk related to managing finances at any organizational level. So without a proper financial framework, we're going to have errors and losses and suspense transactions happening all the time. And we're going to see that by looking at those indicators. Failure to establish budgeting, we're going to see some overs. We're going to see poor decisions or late decisions happening in terms of spending decisions. And we can start comparing actual versus planned expenditures in period 12, or in the government later, etc. break those down into the 3 categories. I'll just throw up some other ones. We're looking at legal and regulatory. How many regulations are coming out? How many modifications to those regulations? How many visits are you getting? How many challenges are you getting? Cybersecurity, firewall breaches or attacks. How many applications are operating in the cloud? Because we're looking at inherent levels of risk here. Where's your organization in terms of its maturity level? How many incidents have been reported, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So then I've actually built an application that you can gather all these from your HR system or your finance system, and you can actually provide weighting associated with it. The way I look at this is more of a sensitivity analysis. I would encourage people to run it, especially the first time, just weighted 1 for everything, and then start applying different weights and seeing, you know, how sensitive is it to certain things that are happening, because that may point to areas where you really need to focus your mitigation efforts, if it's super sensitive to that or not. What you get at the end, in this case for financial risk, is you get an overall rating by whatever sub-slice of the organization you pick. And you get as to whether it's coming from volume, complexity, or variability. So which are the contributing factors to that? In addition, it creates a database with the actual values associated with it. So you'll see that there's $20 million in expenditures, as opposed to a 1 in terms of its relative ranking.
Sub-TAA?
That's, in the government, it's the program activity, program alignment architecture now. So it's just an activity.
I work with ours in defense, so I'm
Okay.
just curious who's that in. Maybe I don't need to know.
You don't need to know.
Okay.
You're from defense. I was 15 years in national defense as an auditor. And then you can combine the finance, the HR, the other operational risks, and combine those. So when I was at one department, I actually had access to the HR system, the finance system, and the operational system, and I was the only person in the department that managed to pull it all together. And I was dealing with data at the transactional level and rolling it up and pulling it all together. So I can see all sorts of things. Taking a look at something like capital projects, I can look at what type of, where are the risks associated with. Each of the spokes are a capital project. The further you move away from the center, the higher the risk. So I can see that, you know, this one has a higher financial risk, but it's not doing too badly on the legal and on the IT risk, as opposed to perhaps this one here. So I can start focusing on, if I'm looking at that project, I'm not going to waste my time on the IT side of it too much, but I'm certainly going to be talking to them about their legal risk as well as their financial and their strategic risks. And it allows you to drill down. In this case, I said I wanted to look at not only activities, but I wanted to look at departments and their financial management processes. So this is looking at different departments and looking at their use of things like purchase orders, fund reservations, work breakdown structure. So the environment in which they're managing those. And I was doing one, well, it'll remain nameless, but it was a $4 billion weapons system, and they were using 4 GLs to manage the finances. Regular pay, overtime, travel, and then one for the weapon system. And it's going to impact hugely on things like your ability to forecast maintenance costs, because you don't really have a good, clear awareness of the cost of that. So I'd be able to tell, if this was project-based, I could say, you know what, there's some major projects that aren't using some of the tools that are available to them, and I can tell that. This is an extract from SAP, by the way. So again, I can drill down. So I can determine if it was financial risk that was causing something to show up fairly high. I can say, is it because of volume, variability, or complexity? So just drill down into it. If it was variability, I can drill down again, and I can look at what portion of the variability is causing the problem associated with this, or the risk associated with this. So that's it for risk, in that sense. But I also want to tie it to performance. So typically, when you have strategic initiatives, you actually will identify risks associated with that at the time on the strategic planning process. And hopefully you will identify performance indicators. But I found that through research we've been doing and looking at, there's not a lot of work that's being done to develop key risk indicators at the same time. And that those aren't used in a regular basis. So I said I was going to introduce this topic. So that's my introduction. No. So what you can do then is you can, when you hit certain trigger points, you can look at the risk indicators, or the risk indicators can trigger reviews, and then you can start looking at revising your strategies and your KPIs, so that you're not setting something up 6 months before you start it, and then a year later you don't look at it again. You can look at it on an ongoing basis and say, you know what, in our case, a new government, or got a new budget, or reduction in spending, or some event has occurred that has really changed the whole playing field, and we need to adjust our KPIs because now our KRIs are off.
So one other thing, like a KPI and KRI, they just go together. For example, if you are not meeting a KPI, it automatically it becomes a risk, basically.
Yes,
right?
yeah, I would say so. But there are some times when you're going to have risk indicators are actually going to drive some of your performance indicator, increase or decrease the likelihood of you meeting your performance indicators. So they're very much related. They're like a flip side of the coin.
Right, yeah.
Or at least they
So
should.
it's a three-sided coin because it's got controls on the other side. Yeah.
But at least they should be matched, rather than the danger is that they won't be
Yeah.
matched.
And by identifying the risks and then identifying indicators that you can measure, you can now see the impact that that's going to have on your KPIs. Because you just tend to measure your KPIs as you move along. You don't measure changes or impacts on those KPIs. So I just think that this is something that it's based on our research. It's not being done a lot. There's not a lot of people using KRIs. And they're certainly not linking them with the KPIs, and yet it tries to address a lot of the inherent problems with typical risk situations where it's very subjective, top-down, high-level. You can't drill down into it. And if you start using this, you can learn more and more about your systems, about your business processes, about the risk levels and where they're going to be impacted.
Thanks, David. Any further questions or comments for David?